Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Occupational Hygiene webinar. My name is Justin Hobday, Chief Operating Officer at our HSE Support Cluster within SafetyCloud, and I'll be your host for today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce a little of who we are. AssureCloud and SafetyCloud form part of Safety SA. We're a South African risk-based management company focused on helping organizations reduce risk, strengthen compliance, and create safer workplaces. Today's webinar highlights one of our key service areas, occupational hygiene, an essential component of workplace health and regulatory compliance. We're joined today by our presenter, Andrea Marshall. Andrea is the operations manager at our occupational hygiene business unit at SafetyCloud, and we're also joined by several of our hygienists who will support the Q&A session at the end. A few quick house rules before we begin. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the session. You're welcome to post as many questions as you like in the Q&A panel at any time. We'll address them during the dedicated Q&A segment at the end of the webinar. After the webinar, we'll send an email with the recording along with helpful resources and follow-up links. Just want to thank you all very much for joining us today. We really do appreciate your time, and I'd like to now hand over to Andrea to begin today's presentation. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Justin, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let's begin by looking at the foundation of workplace health, a comprehensive occupational hygiene management program. This program allows you to identify, evaluate, and control health risks in the workplace. A strong program is more than a compliance requirement. It's a proactive design system designed to protect employees, reduce operational risk, and prevent downtime. And when it's implemented well, it forms the backbone of your organization's risk prevention strategy. So let's get into it. Okay. So in order to develop an occupational hygiene management program, one needs to go back to the basics. The definition of occupational hygiene from a textbook perspective can be defined as the science and art of anticipating, recognizing, evaluating, and controlling workplace health hazards to protect workers in the community. The aim of what we do is to prevent illness, impaired health, and discomfort. Now, ill health can manifest in two ways, either through acute effects when symptoms appear after a very short duration of exposure to something that's harmful, or to a very high concentration of something that is harmful. But what we focus more on in our business and in our field is looking at the chronic effects of symptoms that progress, take 40 years or more to progress during an employee's lifespan. So these symptoms of disease happen after very small exposures or continuous exposure, and usually the disease is only identified many years after the person has been exposed, and very often at the point of retirement. Now, what am I talking about when I talk about these health hazards? So the stresses that we look at can be grouped into broad categories, mainly the chemicals, which looks at dust, fumes, and particulate matters, physical agents such as exposures to poor illumination levels, extreme thermal conditions such as heat and cold, noise and vibration, radiation, mainly non-ionizing radiation, and indoor air quality that can impact overall employee well-being and productivity. We also have a look at the impact of biological agents on worker health, such as bacteria, viruses, molds, and fungi, as well as ergonomic interactions. So the interaction of the employee with their workplace or their workstation, where people usually focus on physical, cognitive, and organizational or psychosocial aspects. Now, occupational hygiene is governed by the Department of Employment and Labor under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, where it is very specifically stated that employers need to keep the workplace safe and free from health risks. The work that we do in occupational hygiene is guided by the health regulations, which are namely environmental regulations for workplaces. These are going to be repealed and replaced by the physical agents regulations, which has already been promulgated but will come into effect and be needed to be implemented by September 2026. Similarly, the noise-induced hearing regulations will be repealed and replaced by the noise exposure regulations, also for implementation by September 2026. We also have a look at hazardous chemical agents regulations, as well as the lead and asbestos regulations for chemical exposures, hazardous biological agents regulations, the ergonomics regulations, as well as facilities regulations. Now, each and every one of these regulations follow the same format. And so if you are grasping the concept of one regulation, it should not be very difficult to understand the format and thought process behind all of the health regulations. Basically, the trends are that exposure risk assessments need to be conducted as a minimum biannually, so every 2 years, unless something has happened in the workplace, like an incident, or someone has been diagnosed with an occupational disease, or there's been a significant change in process that makes one question the validity of the current risk assessment. Secondly, from this, occupational hygiene surveys, so actual exposure surveys and assessments need to be done based on what has been identified as significant risks. And based on the results of the actual quantified exposure results, controls and the maintenance of these controls needs to be addressed following the hierarchy of controls, which is something that us in the SHEC field should all be familiar with. One other thing that is also very prominent among many others in these regulations is information and training, which means that people who are exposed, employees who are exposed, have the right to be informed of what they are exposed to, what the potential health effects are, and how they need to cooperate with the employer to make use of the implemented controls, such as using the extraction fan, wearing their PPE, and cooperating with occupational hygiene measurements and medical surveillances. So all of our regulations will follow and have these aspects in it, and then specific sub-regulations that are specific to the actual agent that they are controlling. So if we go back to my definition on the first slide, we can see that the anticipation and recognition is covered by the risk assessments. The evaluation will be covered by the actual measurement surveys, where we measure and quantify the exposure and compare it to the legal limits that are published in these regulations. And then the reports that we submit with the recommendations would then guide the control of these risks and hazards. And this would be then repeated every single 2 years. Pretty similar to our Plan, Do, Check, Act process that many of us in the field use, and then to track and record continual improvements of your health risks in the workplace. Now, many of us spend a lot of time on the risk assessment and specifically on the surveys. It ticks a lot of the compliance boxes and is usually seen as the biggest part of maintaining compliance. But the most important part, which is often overlooked or given the least attention, is the actual control measures. So very often the reports, if you look at them year on year, do not show any change in the implemented or in controls that have actually been implemented. So control is obviously the crux and where the secret is of managing occupational hygiene risks in the workplace. It follows the same hierarchy that has become popular in our field, where we look at elimination and substitution of the risk. Elimination is extremely difficult to do, especially if you have an existing process, because it would often mean that you would need to change your entire business, which might not be very financially viable. Substitution might be a little bit easier, especially with hazardous chemicals. If you can substitute a chemical that is less hazardous with one that is or substitute a more hazardous with a less hazardous chemical, or the form of the chemical, for example. But very often, it is easier to come in at the engineering, admin, and PPE controls. Where engineering, we would look at automating, isolating, or ventilating an area. So you either remove the person from the source of exposure, or you remove the source of exposure from the person, either through a physical barrier and or extracting the ventilation, extracting the source of exposure through ventilation or diluting the concentration in the air. Procedurally, we look at administrative controls where we either try to have safe working procedures, work instructions, good housekeeping, work scheduling, where we can actually try to put plans in place to reduce exposure, where we do not allow people to enter hazardous areas unless they have to, or we do not allow, or we rotate jobs so people have less time of being exposed. So basically paperwork-driven controls, training, medical surveillance, things like that. And then lastly, the one that is used the most often, but often very the least effective, is the personal protective equipment, where we would either barricade the person through hearing protection, respiratory protection, gloves, masks, face shields, things like that, to prevent them from being exposed to something harmful. And that would be the crux of a monitoring program that would be, if implemented well, would be successful. Now, since 2019, the Department of Employment and Labour have actively been revising all of the health-related legislation in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And there have been vast improvements that have been made. We can see that in 2019, ergonomics was promulgated for the first time. Asbestos abatement regulations were updated. We had updates to the hazardous chemical and biological agents in 2021 and 22. And then this year, we had the physical agents and noise exposure regulations, which are the latest ones for us to have a look at. So there has been a concerted effort to have a look and focus on health regulations in the Act, which means that there will be a concerted effort from the department when they're having a look at implementation and compliance. So if we have to think about what the changes of these regulations mean for our monitoring program, I can highlight a few steps for you here that we can see what the golden thread was that has been sewn through these newly promulgated regulations. The first one is that there has been a lot of emphasis on the definition of the competent person. So either the definition will be that an approved inspection authority needs to come and do the work, an AIA, or that the person does not have to be an AIA, but then the person has to meet the definition of a competent person. So that would mean that there's a regular or applicable formal qualification, or that there's sufficient knowledge and hands-on experience on how to deal with these health stresses, or a combination of both. That would then suffice in standing up in a court of law to say that this person knew what they were doing when they were assessing health risk. And this is such a serious definition that the department has even published an additional documents for expanding on what the intention is behind the definition of the competent person. And that can be found under their publications on the website. Then the second thing, and the trend that has just comes up over and over and over again, is that the risk assessment is vital. It dictates the monitoring program. So every employer needs to build an occupational risk exposure profile for each of their occupational categories or similar exposed groups, so that they know exactly who is exposed to what when it comes down to if something had to happen, or they have to place a person, that they know exactly where their high risks lie. And from that, every decision that is made for the control thereafter can then be considered as a risk-based decision. It is extremely important and has been highlighted over and over again in engagement sessions with the Department of Employment and Labour. Okay, so again, the risk assessment. and monitoring results are vital because they influence the following medical surveillance program that might need to be implemented. So these results will be used by your occupational medical practitioner or OMP, and it is also now very clearly stipulated that your OMP needs to be involved in designing your risk-based medical surveillance program, so that you don't have generic medicals taking place that could actually save you money and prevent unnecessary exposures. For example, when we send unnecessarily send people for chest x-rays who don't necessarily need to have them. We are then required in these new regulations not to just have an overview of every single occupational exposure category, but to also identify vulnerable persons in our risk assessment. Now, the vulnerable person can be an individual who has an underlying condition, has to take certain medication that might impact his exposure, or it could be a broader group, for example, pregnant women who have to work on a factory floor, or women of childbearing age who might be exposed to chemical agents that could affect the health of their babies if they fall pregnant. And this needs to be taken into consideration regardless of whether they intend on having children or not, but that choice is not taken away from them. This could also apply to men. It could apply to an aged workforce where the special considerations might need to be implemented or considered. And this needs to be identified in the risk assessments. And then additionally, we need to also look at concomitant or additive exposures. So exposures to different agents, which when take place together, can influence the health effects negatively. They can highlight them. They can make them worse. They can make them present a lot faster. So ones that have been highlighted in the regulations would be exposure to noise and whole body vibration, which can increase the risk of hearing loss, as well as exposure to noise and certain chemicals which work on the auditory nerve and can cause hearing loss on their own. And the rules and guidelines are stipulated in the regulations as to how to handle those exposures. And then also having a look at stressor interrelationships. So how a biological risk factor can be created because a physical stressor has not been controlled, for example, such as humidity in an office building or ventilation system. And having a look at how these exposures together can add up to make a much worse scenario than when they act on their own. Important to note is also that there are seasonal variations that will play a role in how you plan your surveys. For example, we can't measure heat in winter, and we shouldn't be measuring cold stress in December. And when we are looking at concomitant exposures, such as being exposed to cold and vibration, those need to be measured together, and they need to be measured at the worst case scenario, such as the coldest time in winter. There have been some changes to the exposure limits in the regulations. So where your baseline might have identified previously that you don't have a significant risk, this might need to be updated or will need to be updated in your risk assessment documentation, and additional monitoring might now be required in areas where previously it wasn't. There have been some newly promulgated stresses which really weren't explicitly required in the previous regulations, the environmental regulations for workplaces. Although implied under Section 8 of the Act, these are now very clearly indicated in the new physical agents regulations, and that is indoor air quality, where there are definitive guidelines now, non-ionizing radiation, as well as vibration, whole body and hand-arm. So we might need to add these to your existing program. You might need to consider updating your baseline risk assessments. And then in these regulations, they've been published guideline documents where there has been quite a bit of elaboration on information and training of employees. It needs to be formalized now with a portfolio of evidence where you have the appointment of a competent person to do the training. So it doesn't have to be a third party, but they need to be competent. There needs to be proof of evidence, and there needs to be a course content or overview that you can provide if needed to show what has been done. It needs to happen at the commencement of employment and then annually thereafter if people are exposed to hazardous agents. And there needs to be some sort of manner in which you can demonstrate that the content of the training has been understood by the employee. So there has been quite a bit of focus on information and training so that people are being made aware of the conditions that they're working in. So this is maybe going to then affect how you plan for your legal compliance and how you plan your surveys. If I say it again, I'll say it 100 times. Occupational risk assessment is vital. It needs to be complete, compliant, and comprehensive so that risk-based decisions can be made, that can be made from this information. And this document is one of the first documents that will probably be requested by the Department of Labor or an auditor if there is an inspection or an investigation for an incident. You need to draw up your monitoring plan and document it so that your schedule can help you keep track of seasonal variations, high production times, and the like, because it is very important that to get the most out of your surveys, because it only happens every 2 years, that you get the worst case scenario so you know what the worst possible conditions would be, and that would be when your production is highest, not when you're in a shutdown or a quiet time. And I know that sometimes that can be very hectic for your production team, but it is very important to be measuring and assessing when things are at their busiest. In the guidance notes again that are stipulated in the regulations, it states that you need to document an action plan from the results of assessments and surveys so that you can have a look at what your immediate controls are and plan for longer term controls. In the report, there would be a variety from your supplier, there would be a variety of recommendations. We are not enforcers as AIAs, which means that it is up to the employer to make a decision as to what controls would be best suited for their workplace. So we provide a variety of controls according to the hierarchy as best as we can. But it is not that each of these need to be actioned. The action plan needs to be drawn up by the company, by the employer, where they've taken consideration of financial repercussions of these things, budgeting, resources availability, and so forth. So you would then be able to show your thought process on paper. It cannot be, oh, well, we're planning on this, or we're thinking about a certain way of doing things. It needs to be documented so that if the person who is planning all of these things has to leave the company, there's still a clear plan on how to work towards continuous improvement. So this is vitally important and will also be requested if there is an inspection that takes place. Surveys should not be done in isolation, and where they can, they should be grouped. The reason for this is because there are so many interrelationships between the different health stresses that can impact on a person's health, and therefore if you are doing them separately or at different times because of budget requirements or production requirements, you need to make sure that the information, at least from previous and other assessments, are made available to whoever it is that is doing these inspections so that they can have the best chance possible of connecting the dots and linking potential additional problems other than just if they're coming to measure one stressor. Failing to plan is definitely planning to fail. So if you are organizing an assessment and you're not informing people properly of the people that are coming onto site or that these assessments are taking place, you might run the risk of not getting the best out of the exercise. So all stakeholders should be informed of the assessment dates so that they can have input, that they can know that people will be walking around and that it's not for a slap on the wrist, but rather to improve work conditions. And therefore they would need to make sure that they're available for answering questions, simulating parts of the process that might not be running, and so forth. and that when at the end of the day, when the reports are submitted and decisions start needed to be made, that there needs to be multidisciplinary input to create proper action plans and select the best controls. So we need to have the engineers, the maintenance staff involved, because they might need to be actually physically affecting some of these controls, and they might have better ideas because they deal with the actual infrastructure on a daily basis. You might need to have the input of your management and finance because they might need to make budgets available or understand what is required in the next few years to plan for budgeting going forward. You might need to get procurement involved so that they're on board when it comes to selecting less hazardous materials, and they have policies in place that don't just go on price but go on an overall risk assessment of what is happening, of what you're trying to bring into the company. And then because of sensitive information that might needed to be passed back and forth, like the vulnerable person identification or working with the doctors, the OMPs for trends, you might need to get your HR involved, or you should get your HR involved to make sure that confidentiality and dignity is maintained for all employees. So those were just a few of the points that we wanted to highlight while we were sharing this. And we really do hope that this has been a useful information for you. Occupational hygiene isn't just a lot more than a legal obligation. It's an investment in your workforce, your productivity, and your long-term resilience of your business. So thank you for joining me and listening to my story. And we will now move into our Q&A session, where I'm going to have my colleagues assisting me, Edwin, Khada, Janine, and Zama, and are going to support in answering all the questions that you've been posting in the Q&A chats. I thank you again, and that would be all from me.
Thanks, Andrea. So I'll continue with the questions. Just be reminded, if I don't get to your question, we shared the email address that you can email as well. Feel free to send us the questions on email. You can contact us at any time and we'll get back to you. But let's continue with questions. So next one we're going to look at is when conducting a comprehensive occupational hygiene survey in a facility, the fluctuating production cycles, how do you ensure that your sampling strategy, measurement methods, and control evaluations accurately reflect peak exposure scenarios rather than average, while still meeting with the methodological validity, legal compliance, and statistical reliability? Okay, so Janine, can I maybe ask you to look at this question for us?
Yes, thank you, Edwin. So with fluctuating cycles, when you do area noise, it's good to actually wait for 3 cycles within a work area when there is fluctuating noise. And then also another thing to do to actually capture the peak is to do a measurement at the operator's ear. That's also a good method to get the peak of that precise fluctuating noise. And then also when doing personal noise dosimetry, where we place a dosimeter on the person close to the ear for the entire shift, you get your average, but you also get your peak for the day in that shift where they were exposed to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then, next question. Can we use the hygiene survey to determine the correct lifting weight for a person who lifts heavy stuff through an 8-hour shift? Gerda, can I please ask you to take the question?
100%. So you can't necessarily do it per person because there's a lot of confounding factors. Every person is different. The person themselves might also differ from day to day if they're feeling sort of sick or anything like that. So you're going to have to do an ergonomics risk assessment and have that inform safety protocols to have a safe standard for a weight for your full employment staff, from the most strongest to the most vulnerable to potential the health effects from lifting. Okay, so the short and sweet answer there is no, you can't determine it for a specific person, but you can determine the risk by conducting an ergonomics risk assessment.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So I see, must all the surveys stipulated in the iShape be done by an AIA? Yes, it's only us that we can do it. We need to get the money. I'm only joking. So, no. So the stuff that's SANAS accredited, which is noise, hazardous chemical agents, asbestos, maintenance control measures, which falls under hazardous chemical agent regulations, that's your extraction, ventilation, and then noise. So all of that needs to be done by AIA. All the other stuff can be done by competent persons. However, usually you find that AIAs are already competent in that, and they can include it already in the surveys that they are conducting on site, which makes it a little easier. So it takes some of the responsibility of you as the company to do it yourself. And then you'll get recommendations from people that have done this for quite a while as well. So no, it doesn't have to be done by AIA. Okay, so there we go. That's all the time we have for the questions. As I said, if I did not get to your question, please feel free to email it to us and we'll get back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you, Andrea, for the presentation under some difficult circumstances there. And thanks to the panelists also for jumping in and helping us with the questions that came in from the audience. And probably more importantly, thank you very much to everybody that attended today. We're highly appreciative of your time, so thank you very much. Just a reminder, I have seen that there's been a few of you asking about the actual recordings, and we'll send the recording out with supporting material to everybody that's been on this session with us. If you've got any further questions or you would like any further information on the occupational hygiene services we provide, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our email address is aia@assurecloud.co.za. And then finally, just want to thank everybody for their patience today. I think that one of the difficulties sometimes with live webinars is you are a little bit exposed to the technology, and we really appreciate your time while we dealt with some of the technical challenges. Hope it wasn't too disruptive, but we really do appreciate your time. And then finally, just on behalf of Safety SA, SafetyCloud and AssureCloud, thank you very much for everybody who joined us today. We really are appreciative of you. And until next time, thank you very much. Bye-bye.